It's gonna start filling up, I promise, that one. It should start filling up, I promise. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of these 2017 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Barry Brudney. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and the lead for our panel today, Sports Gambling Mainstream Appeal, or Gambling on Mainstream Appeal, the Future of Sports Betting. And for today, I'm really honored to be able to just present the speakers for our discussion today. So starting from my left, we have Kip Levin, the CEO of Betfair US, Jeff Ma, the Senior Director of Analytics for Twitter, Joe Brennan Jr., the CEO of Sport AD, Jake Williams, the Head of Legal for Sportradar US, and our moderator today, Chad Millman, VP and Editorial Director for ESPN. Today's panel will last for 45 minutes, and we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. In order to be able to submit a question, we ask that you please post through Twitter using the hashtag #NewAgeGambling. At the end, the questions with the most comments will be picked for our moderator, and with that, I'll hand it over to Chad.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for joining us early in the morning. I think the most pressing question that everybody always has and wants to know is, how does sports betting become legal in the United States? And I think each of you probably have a different and interesting perspective on that. So Kip, we'll start with you and just sort of give us your perspective on how this actually happens.
Well, I think a couple of things have to happen. Obviously, there are, we think about the laws at the federal level in between PASPA and the Wire Act. I think there's a lot of momentum right now to change, modify, or get rid of PASPA, which is positive. And I think, our U.S. business is predominantly in horse racing right now, which has a law that sits side by side with the Wire Act. It's called the Interstate Horse Racing Act that allows online betting for horse racing. So I think if PASPA goes away, you need something, especially for online, to sit side by side with the Wire Act that would say that it's
Can you just explain what PASPA is for people?
Yeah, so PASPA, and some of these guys can probably explain better, but PASPA was passed in the early 90s, which basically is protection against professional sports and amateur sport betting. So that's the one that has a lot of pressure right now because technically it's a federal law, but there are states that have exclusions. So Nevada obviously is excluded. So a lot of the things that you're hearing in New Jersey, for example, are questioning whether or not it should be a federal law because there are states that have opted out of it. And I think New Jersey, obviously, if it could go back in time, would have opted out at the time that the law passed. So they're basically, a lot of the lobbying groups, the AGA, for example, are saying it should be a states' rights issue and let the states figure it out. But I think, again, if you don't have something like we have in horse racing, with the Interstate Horse Racing Act, then you run into a situation where it could open up, but it could open up just for sort of retail casinos, for example, to open up sports books everywhere. And it would be harder for an online operator like us to move in and run online businesses.
Jake, what do you think?
So there's a lot of more smart people out there than I am, but some people talk about New Jersey as the path, or the quickest path especially. And if you read, Daniel Wallach or Ryan Rodenberg or some of these people and how they break it down, and it's certainly not going to be exciting for me to go into the legal aspects, but there's some 10th Amendment issues, and then there's some, there's potential for Solicitor General of the United States to provide some commentary on that. And if that happens, there's talk that it's 1 year away, but there's obviously a lot of nuances with that anyway. So I think it's there's certainly a federal idea, which I think Adam Silver most notably brought up about a federal framework, and then there's states' rights, and I think it's going to be very difficult to predict which way it will go, given what's happened in the past. Certainly people have predicted in the past it would happen sooner. Some people said it would be later, so I think it's a very difficult thing to try and predict the easiest path, but there are certain ways that it could happen soon. But I think in general, I guess we just have to wait and see. But PASPA is the main element to all of this.
Jeff, thoughts there?
I mean, I don't know a lot about any of the legislation or any of the, but I mean, at the end of the day, look at what happened in the NFL this year, right? Ratings were down. Look at what's happening in every league. Teams are selling for more and more. And the thing that people have always had to fall back on, is they buy a franchise for $500 million, it becomes worth $1.5 billion, these teams go up in value, the rights get sold for more money every time, but now all of a sudden it's like, if ratings are going down, how are we gonna get ratings back up? And everybody knows, like, you guys are a perfect example, like you do Streak for the Cash for like some crappy game, and people all of a sudden are gonna watch WNBA on Thursday night because they care, right? And if gambling becomes legal, the engagement on a lot of these different games that, like Sunbelt Thursday night game, like why is someone watching that game? Because they bet on it, right? And if that becomes the case, like, I just think that there's so much money at stake here that at some point, like, I don't know exactly how it happens, but like everyone's gonna align and say like, hey, guys, we need to continue building value for our owners and building value for these franchises that are so much. And like, there's just too much at stake for them not to do this.
Joe, I feel like you're going to have a lot to say on the question and what Jeff just said.
I'm going to try and limit myself. What I'll say is this, is the best case scenario from a litigation sense right now that New Jersey's case is being considered by the Supreme Court of the United States, the most optimistic window would be after the Solicitor General, who hasn't been nominated yet, would weigh in, would be getting a decision sometime in 2018, which would then allow the states probably to move forward sometime in 2019. That's for some of us, that's a pretty long way. If it's going to be a legislative relief with Congress, you're probably looking at somewhere optimistically a 3 to 5 year window if you can find the right mix. And I'm picking up on something that Jeff is talking about here, and that is, what's the value besides obviously the money when it comes to talking to lawmakers and moving this issue? And so far, I would say most people, the AGA included, have probably done a disservice to advancing this by focusing really solely on the money and also on the consumer protection. There has to be really a more positive way. If you go to a lawmaker and you say, well, you should really get rid of this ban because, well, first of all, it's ineffectual. You can't stop it anyway, and there's a lot of money in it. What you're telling the lawmaker is, you're impotent, and you should just take the money. Lawmakers generally don't like that. They have to fall back and justify their vote. So I think it's incumbent upon people who are in favor of this to come up with more positive messages, more positive reasons why to do this. One of the things that Jeff talked about is it's increased fan engagement. It's been proven time and time again. Daily fantasy sports, in its brief arc here, has increased fan engagement. And the leagues recognize this. Major League Baseball, in the past couple of weeks, have admitted that they've studied this, like how much would gambling increase engagement with theirs. In the past, when NFL lawyers have been deposed in the New Jersey lawsuit, they've admitted that they've studied this, and that just right now, the opportunity to increase fan engagement, the financial opportunity, doesn't outweigh what they perceive as the loss to the value of their business. So until we do a better job of creating positive messages, whether it's innovation, whether it's engagement, things like that, it's going to be a tough road, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or whatever.
What are the elements, and Kip and Jake certainly, with companies that are based in Europe and have huge European footprints, what are innovations you've seen that, from a data perspective, from a horse racing perspective, that you guys can bring from overseas that can help develop the landscape here?
Well, I think, extending on the theme of engagement in sports, and baseball is a great example, right? The big trend in Europe now is, mobile is a huge percentage of the business. It's probably over 70, 80% in sports. And what's come along with that, and what's come along with the expansion of streaming rights and the availability of content through streaming, that's been another sort of macro level technology that's led to this. But the in-play betting, right? So the engagement in in-play, it's unbelievable. It's over 50% of the total handle, and in some cases even more. And as if you look at sports, and that's the longer sports, so a baseball game, it's 4 or 5 hours. Probably I would predict to be 80, 90% of the total betting handle would be throughout the course of the game. So that's a big trend. And I think if that again, if sports betting comes here and it's online and so on, that'll be a huge driver of fan engagement in sports, no question.
Certainly, I think the real-time aspect is what everyone in and around the ecosystem of the sport wants. So whether that's advertisers, whether that's great content in the moment, and then the data can fuel that. But I think certainly with the US, it seems to be stifled because anytime you get to a certain level and it's focused on or attached or connected within the gambling industry or related to gambling, sometimes there can be apprehension as to whether or not that's a good way to move, especially given the current legislation within the United States. So I think certainly in Las Vegas you see certain things, but I think any time it gets to a level where it's going to be useful, it can arguably be more useful outside of the US. And then that sends people overseas, for example, so they might be more focused on going to London, for example, or somewhere else where there is an ecosystem that makes sense for their business and attracting those other parts of the sporting industry, whether it's the fan engagement stuff or the brands and advertising and things like that they need within their business. So I think the problem is within the US, it seems to be stifled a little bit because of that apprehension, certainly. And then it is being pushed overseas, but with the major sports here in the US, there's obviously a huge focus from the data and the analytics and then the real-time engagement of those fans. So I think that's certainly the next stage, is that in-the-moment type stuff. And as Kip was saying with the mobile, young fans who are always on their phones, you see the leagues now trying to shorten the games, less timeouts, less ads in between, whether it's quarters, halves, things like that. It's certainly a focus, and it's all sort of pushing in one direction when it is younger fans watching shorter games and just engaging those fans.
So, Jeff, real time keeps coming up, data keeps coming up, mobile keeps coming up. Twitter is like at the epicenter of all of that. Do you guys actually try to keep track of sort of a gambling perspective of what's happening on your platform?
We have like 320 million users, and
I'm aware.
As much as so I think it's very interesting, right? Like gambling is a huge use case for Twitter. And like one of the things that we are, right, and like we're a platform more than anything. So we enable, real-time one-to-many communication, and that's the power of it. Specific applications like this are not something that we've necessarily ever embraced, maybe wrongly on our part. We're aware that this is happening and we love it, but like, how do we enable it in a better way? I don't know. What I find interesting is about this conversation is like, so when I think about like when sports gambling becomes legal in the US, the number of companies in industry that will emerge from it I think it's going to be a huge boom, right? Like if, just backstage talking to some people about the amount of business that was coming from the US from one of the big offshore bookmakers back before UGA was in place they said it was like about 70% of that. So it's like, it's going to be huge in the US. DFS has taught me that it's going to be huge in the US. And one of the things that becomes interesting is like, and I think this is like, Kip, like, I'm sorry, Jake, the business of data, right, in the US is going to become huge because of this, because all the data feeds in the US suck right now. ESPN's like right now the leaders in like these, like if you're trying to follow play-by-play for like a Western Kentucky game, like the only place you can get it is like on ESPN, right? Like it's not like these.
That's awesome.
No, it is. What a plug. But Ryan Spoon, I have him on speed dial because anytime your data feed goes down, I am hitting and killing Spoon because it's down, right?
Ryan Spoon runs product for ESPN.
Yeah, and
I don't think everyone here knows that.
Well, you do, and I knew you'd explain it. You're comprehensive.
Now you know who to send your resume to.
My point is that, like the level of scrutiny, like can you imagine like if Yahoo went up 3% one day and all the feeds said it went down 3%? Because that's what sports data is like a lot of times. It's like just wrong. And so I think like we're not even ready in some ways for sports betting to become, like the industries aren't ready because like the data feeds, like to me, it's crazy how bad sports data feeds are. And like, it's interesting because I wonder outside of the US, so like in the third tier, fourth tier soccer like games, right, where there's definitely a lot of money being bet on them, are the data feeds better than they are on like the 3rd tier, 4th tier college basketball games in the US? I'm asking, I don't know.
I mean, there are examples where, you know, in the more mature betting markets, where the data is coming directly, typically from the sport itself. So tennis is a good example, right? Like when the judge is putting in the score after every point, like that goes out to obviously all the sports broadcasters and so on, but there's also a direct feed to the operators who are rev sharing back to the sports governing bodies. So it's a good example of how, you know, if you look down the road, how things should evolve, right? Like, you know, I mean, in horse racing, for example, we all get an instant data feed as soon as the race goes off that immediately triggers our websites to stop taking bets and our apps to stop taking bets on that. So the data partnership, again, it's all part of how the revenue sharing works. It's phenomenal, right? And it's definitively ahead of, you know, what you have here.
Well, that does feel like you know, appropriately for this conference, data feels like the Trojan horse for making leagues potentially comfortable with sports betting and understanding that the data is where they potentially find the most value. I mean, your company is sort of at the leading edge of all of that. How do you guys think that data can manifest itself into something bigger?
For me?
Yes, you.
So I think it depends. So if you're in the media industry, which is what we service here in the US, there's different requirements from a betting provider or even just a casual bettor, for example. So if you have a certain sport that you're focusing on, if you're focusing on the Sun Belt or you're focusing on 3rd division Chinese soccer, whatever it might be, if you can't get great data that you can rely on, putting your money behind it if you're a bettor, you probably just do it yourself. You're not going to spend a lot of money if it's not very good because you're spending a lot of money investing on certain bets. So you really need to, if you want to focus on a certain area and you want to have great data, some people do it themselves. In the US, because it's been a media focus, real-time, live, point-by-point or play-by-play is very good, but it's not people who are investing their money behind it necessarily who need to make sure it's really, really 100% correct. And then you've got other issues with speed and timing and latency that plays into it, and whether you want to be first or correct or both, and then who you're servicing, so what your clients want. If they just want to know there's been a touchdown scored, that's fine. If they want to know who it was, how many yards it was, who threw it where, what type of play it was, then you get into different elements. So there's a lot of different data elements that go into it. There's a whole segment of the market, in the media market certainly, that want it a certain way and can be provided that way. And then there's more in-depth stuff when we talk about the play-by-play stuff that is a different segment.
Is the quality bar or level for your business in the US different than it is for your business in Europe?
In general, I would say no. Speed and quality is at the certain level that we want it for everything. But just talking about betting or media, there's different requirements for that. So if you're going to bet any game and you're going to put a lot of money down, you need to know that this is correct because you're investing a lot of money. If you're going to go and invest in the stock market, you want to know that your information you have is correct, or the system or software you're using is correct when it's feeding all that in. Otherwise, if you're trading, you know, warrants and bonds and stocks and things like that, you need to know what you've got is correct. Whereas if you're displaying on a blog or you're writing media articles, if it's not 100% correct right at that very moment, it's not going to ruin your business necessarily.
So do you guys have a different level of quality for media versus betting? I mean, I don't understand what you're saying. Obviously, the use case of media versus betting is very different.
Right.
But for you guys as stats providers, do you guys think about that? You're like, well, this isn't going to be used for betting, so it can be shitty.
So it can be wrong.
Right.
That's not certainly how we think. In the US, it's just media and technology, so we only focus on the media and technology side. And that's our core business, so we don't have any gambling. We're not involved with the gambling on the US side, so there's really no need to focus on that, servicing our clients. But if you're talking about other companies outside the world, outside the US, there's obviously different business segments and they got different focuses.
So as a data user, as I'm hearing on both sides of this, I'll agree with Jake that obviously there's different channels and and different needs out there. And I'll agree with Jeff is that, with all apologies to Sport Radar or anybody who's here from Opta or anyplace else, is that frankly, data is not where we need it right now. Okay, part of it is in the way it's being collected, either with the spotters who are at the games or having spotters that are watching the broadcast feed and collect the data that way. It's a remarkably analog way of collecting performance data inside of these games. And for somebody like me and what we do with our company, when we're trying to create really in-running models, down to being able to create propositions that are based on the players. You know, we spend a lot on data, a lot of research beforehand to know what this player is capable of, but what are they doing during the game and the latency and the things like that is frankly, this is where I think the fact that the United States is essentially, has decided to be absent from this industry is a big hole. Can you think of another technology industry out there where the United States has said, okay, we're not going to participate in that, and what you have is European companies that are essentially using the capital that they've built in their markets to come and kind of take an initial stab at the U.S. Whereas when you think about what we're capable here, the things that come across my desk as far as our ability to collect data off of broadcast feeds in real time and things like that, these are the things that we really need. But because the opportunity is so limited, because essentially our legal market is Nevada and a little bit of Delaware during NFL season, investors just look at it and say like, no thanks. And so you have this spectacular opportunity to drive the quality of data right now, and it's not there because A, these guys are not seeing enough back in the form of the fees that we pay them, although it feels like I'm giving a lung every month when I cut that check. And they just don't have the means to be able to expand their own platforms that way.
But isn't that, Jake, like, Kip, do you want to go?
I was just going to say, here's a real example for, from a U.S. perspective. So we run, our core business is TVG, which is the horse racing television network, and then we have apps and websites branded under TVG where you can sign up for an account, go online and bet in most states. We launched the exchange. So and within that, you can watch a streaming, any race. The latency is about a 20 to 30 second delay on the races that you're watching, but that's sort of traditional pool betting where as soon as the race starts, betting stops. When we launched Betfair's exchange in New Jersey for racing as well, we had to invest with our streaming provider to bring it down to 5 to 10 seconds because it was the first time ever that you could bet during a race. So you could, until the first horse crosses the finish line, you can bet for or against horses. So we had to make a significant investment and take it down from 20 to 30 seconds to 5 seconds.
Yeah, and I can tell you, 5 seconds is an eternity.
Yeah.
The people who are, whether it's the regulated business and what we'll call the informal business, where they're offering.
Nice euphemism.
That's a very nice euphemism. The informal business, where in running, even with U.S.-facing informal sports books, has become about 50% of their handle. 5 seconds is an eternity. I mean, the complaints that you hear out of these guys about people who have better broadcast feeds, faster data, and they're just pass posting on in-game wagers where literally just sitting there, banging the button away, hoping that they can get down and like, oh wow, it just happens that they are right every time LeBron makes a shot in the fourth quarter, and it's because the data is just not getting there fast enough. It's something like that. The fact that America has locked itself out of this kind of innovation because of the limited opportunity here, it hurts all sorts of actors, not just the bettors, not just the public, but also the operators. I mean, it's something that that alone, the ability to unlock technology, have room, like the people who are sitting here in this room, for it to be a legitimate thing for you guys to go into. It would be tremendously helpful. And that's one of those positive messages that you could put on the front of this rather than just tax revenue.
Well, it feels like for the people in this room, they could start building better data feeds now, and by the time sports betting is legal, they will be ready to go to market and they will be doing very well.
That's possible.
That's the problem though, right? Like I'm being unfair to the data businesses in the US, because there isn't a lot of incentive for them to have this, because they're not going to be able to monetize it in that same way. So yeah, I mean, like, why wouldn't people stop right now and invest in this data business and start, building towards that? But that's the bet, that sports gambling will become legal in the US. And like, anytime I ask someone when they think, like very knowledgeable people, when that's going to happen, the answer has always been 5 to 10 years. And that was 5 to 10 years ago they were saying that. So like, that's always been, so no one has any clue. I mean, and you guys might have a better clue than I do, but I would bet you don't, because like, nobody really knows how this is going to happen.
Well, they're both with companies that are hedging, right? Like,
yeah, but like, Kip is clearly like a very smart, knowledgeable person, but he's like the third or fourth person that I've met in the last, like, what, 5 years, 10 years that runs Betfair in the US. So it's like,
oh boy.
Yeah.
Throwing down now.
I knew it was coming in some form.
Look, the other thing is, what would be a great thing, and I realize it's tough because we're talking about betting in America, is but to look at what you can develop being something that you can apply internationally. Look, if you take anything away, I can tell you based on the earlier question, like, are the international betting feeds, are they faster than the US media feeds? And I can tell you, because we subscribe to both, no. And they're still not fast enough, even for the betting feeds that they do, because we incorporate the betting markets into the models that we create on individual players. It affects them.
Why do you
they
think
still
that is?
can't get, because I just don't think they're capable of it yet. I think it's largely to do with the way that they're.
But how can, like, that doesn't make sense, right? How can they? So like, high frequency trading,
Right.
is all about like lack of latency, right? If you like, those people that were good at it, it wasn't like a better model, is that they were getting the information quicker, right? And sports betting is big in Europe. Like, I was just talking to someone that says, like, in a soccer game, people are getting $500,000 down pre-game on soccer games, right? So it's big business there. So why can't someone actually figure this out?
Well, to use your own example of high-frequency trading, if I'm a high-frequency trading, if I'm Citadel or somebody like that, I don't have to watch Chad and Jake square off against each other on a play or something like that, like on the basketball court, and then take the result from that, interpret it, input that, and then have that then broadcast out as a data feed to the rest of the world. So, that's what, I mean, believe me, we hear from people, I lost my voice. We hear from people all the time who have this kind of technology, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if you took our HFT platform and employed it in sports betting? Well, the only problem is we're still limited by the human element. We're still limited by the fact that the athletes have to actually play the game before we can interpret the data back.
Do you think like computer vision solves this? Maybe somewhat? Or are you just saying that the nature of the beast is not?
No, I've seen some really interesting stuff over the course of the last couple of years, and it's some of the startups that are coming up where they're able to really accurately use things like the broadcast feed to be able to collect that data that, for instance, right now is being collected near manually by these spotters who are either in the stadium using like their little, iPad-looking device, or they're in a studio somewhere and they're doing it off of the non-delayed broadcast feed. And that's a spectacular way of being able to do it. But can those companies find the money? No, right now most of them are garage banding it. And frankly, most of there's some people who are doing better than others here, but for the most part, the sports analytics world here in the US in particular, is still kind of garage bandish. There's still not the kind of money and investment in it that you think that there would be when we consider all of the movies, Brad Pitt, Moneyball, Billy Beane, and everything that's been talked about. There still isn't a commensurate investment with it, with what we expect out of it. So I think that's the biggest thing that legalization could do is unlock that part of it, and also unlock the people to get behind it. I look at, yesterday on the soccer analytics panel, and I hope he's in here, Ted Knutson, who, he's an expert on soccer analytics. And he came out of Pinnacle, and now he has his own consultancy, and he has his StatsBomb website and podcast, which I highly recommend. Here's a guy who he used the systems that they developed at Pinnacle, which is a really sharp sports book when it comes to soccer, particularly the Asian markets, and he's parlayed that into a career in offering analysis to soccer teams. You look at what people like Tony Bloom, who owns Brighton Football Club in the UK. You know, here's a guy who is a professional gambler, has his own sports book, and he's parlayed the data and the systems that they've developed for him to bet, for his syndicate to bet, and what he's been able to do with Brighton as a team, where they're probably about to get elevated to the Premier League right now. That wouldn't be possible here in the United States, because he would have to completely hide his money, his ability, and he wouldn't be able to bet on open markets here. Whereas if you had that, you know, Chad Millman would be able to take, you know, would be able to convince people to invest in his syndicate, and then the technology and the people that he could hire, just think of what he'd be able to generate here in the United States based on the size and the opportunity of our betting market here.
So by your theory, legalized sports betting would increase the quality of competition.
I think this is like, it's a great point. Like this idea that like, because if sports betting became legal in the US, that the innovation and the level of, like everything would level up. I always talk about like how a sports bettor should be on every broadcast, because they notice stuff that like broadcasters don't notice. Like I joke, like there should always, the clock operator for every game should be one person who has the over and one person who has the under. Because that clock will never be wrong. It'll start at the right time and it'll stop at the right time.
Perfect.
But like I sit there and I'm like, watch a game. Like the only people that notice when they don't stop the clock at the right time are people who have a bet on the game, because they're like, why is this 7 seconds running right now? It should not be running. But like it's just a whole different level of engagement that people don't understand in terms of like how people care about sports. And I agree, the US is missing out on this because we don't have those type of people like helping teams out necessarily.
So Jake, Sports Radar, as we've discussed, is very much a leader in this industry about sports data. What are you seeing on the European side of the organization that is backing up some of the hypotheses that Joe and Jeff are throwing around?
So first of all, I just want to add to what Jeff said. If in this building in the last 24, 48 hours, if you walk around and try and find anything on the betting side, it's not easy. There's a room full of posters upstairs, there's 20 or 30 of them. There might be one about the betting markets for the EPL, the rest are focused on media-related stuff. So I think just in general, when you talk about elevating the levels, if it is, and it's always if and when and until, but if that is the case, I think just the people in this building over the last 24 hours, it's now an avenue where they can go down that path and say, okay, this is something legitimate, this is real. Just like people aspire to go to Wall Street, they might aspire to be a gambling analytics company or something like that. They'll go to Silicon Valley and have a legitimate business where they can start and look people in the eye and say, yep, this is what I'm doing, this is what I stand behind. I don't think it's going to be that easy for MBA students or PhD students who have background in mathematics to then tell their parents after 7 or 8 years of education and a fair bit of money, they're going to go and start a small firm somewhere doing something that may not or may work out here in the US. So I think that's part of the approach that needs to happen. And to what was your other question?
I forgot. But I thought this was a really good answer. No, the question was, with Sports Radar being at the leading edge of data, how are you seeing what they are saying actually being reality in Europe, where it actually can be practiced a little more effectively?
I think certainly the market in general, when it comes to real time, when it comes to even video with the latency, as Kit was talking about 20 seconds, and we heard that 5 seconds is an eternity. Everyone's thinking about the same thing. It's just how you actually do that, whether it's the umpires putting in the data into an iPad, which is fine, but it's not always correct. And if it's not always correct, because the umpire presses the wrong button, which is possible, and there's millions and millions and millions of data points every single game. So instead of a 3-point, it's 2 points. That has a huge impact on every single proposition market, any derivative markets. So it's okay to say, yeah, we've got to hammer this down into half a second, 1 second, whatever it might be. But it's not always that simple. Like you said, the game has to be played. And if it's, for example, if Matt Ryan has the ball on the 3-yard line, 3 minutes left, they're down 4 points. The odds of the Falcons, the odds of them winning that game is probably, I don't know, was it 10, 15, 20%, whatever it might be. If he then throws the ball to Julio, who runs crossing route, and he's out, and he's going to run it in for a touchdown, it takes, 3 or 4 seconds for Julio to run 70 or 80 yards? If you have that information first...
That'd be really fast.
He's fast.
That'd be like Yeah.
Dude,
a
just-
world
Let's say it's 5 or 6,
Yeah.
whatever it is. So that 5 or 6 seconds where the odds of the Falcons winning before that play, if it's 3rd and 10, are not very good. But once he caught the ball and he's out, and no one's going to catch him because he's really fast, as I said, then that information is really, really, really valuable. And if you're a data provider, do you have someone in the stadium who's pressing the Julio touchdown button, and that just shifts the whole game because they're going to go up by 3 points with 3 minutes left, and then it's a whole different ball game? So even things like that, how do you implement that within an actual sport in real time to try and make it correct, firstly, quick, so the speed aspect, and then obviously here we service media, so media want it in a certain way, and then if you're talking about outside of the US, how all the different people involved in the sport, all the different stakeholders, from individual casual bettors sitting at home with their iPad open, probably somewhere in Europe, or people just on Twitter who want to know exactly what's happening during the game. There's a lot of different aspects that go into it, and to answer your question in a roundabout way, people are thinking about it all the time, certainly. It's at the forefront, speed and latency, and also having a quality product. So that high quality aspect needs to fit in with the speed and the latency.
So how does, Joe, I know you want to say something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was
Go ahead.
the most
Go ahead, you
impressive
go.
display of football knowledge by an Australian I ever heard. But I think the solution that Jake is talking about, and kind of come back to where you're at earlier when you said, well, how does this become a point of comfort for the leagues? I think in some ways the leagues are already there. You had the NFL announce this past week that all the teams are going to be implementing the RFID technology for the high performance stats this coming season. But inexplicably not going to be not make the data available until after the season. If there's anybody from the NFL here, I can use it this season, I promise you. But
Sure,
yeah,
we'll get a response.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. But no, there's two types of data that we're really talking about here. We're talking about media data, which is being able to feed like the ESPN widgets on the game. They're giving people play-by-play, and then it's the real deep data that not only the teams who are looking at the performance of their players and trying to make decisions, but that people who are frankly on the betting side, that not only are they hungry for that kind of data, they're creating their own data right now. So, but that's where the opportunity is going to be for the leagues, I think, going forward, is that kind of value add. I mean, the leagues have already been defeated in federal court here, Major League Baseball in particular, when it came to asserting an IP right over game data. That just kind of slows things down. But for that deeper performance data, yeah, absolutely. That's where the NFL, the NBA, everybody can really, going forward, if they're looking for a way to make the economics better and bring it to a level where it's going to be acceptable for them, because they're not going to get a special tax put on top of this, whether it's federal or state, to pay them out. The government's not really in the business of making billionaires even richer, but particularly if they can keep it for their tax coffers. But for that kind of value-added data that helps people like me and others really dig into performance, that should be universal. And it shouldn't be trialed, it should be right now.
So, Kip, you guys have done a lot of work on sort of decreasing latency. Mm-hmm. And when you have data that needs to be viewed and then input by a human, how can you get to a point where the latency is efficient enough that people can act on it in real time?
Well, technically, I probably can't answer that question, but it's absolutely critical. But in racing, again, to use horse racing as an example, there's some debate by the
Do the
tracks.
horses have sensors on them?
No.
Because I mean, like what Joe was saying is the answer, right? Which is like you take the humans out of the equation. You put RFID tags. You do computer vision. There's some way to do this where it doesn't So we keep talking about latency, but latency is there's a lot of steps to this latency, right? One is this human interaction thing, which seems like, yes, we probably should remove that because humans are bad at things, right? So if we can remove that, that's the first step. Then there's the data technology, bandwidth issue. That's another thing. That one I think should have been solved a long time ago because it's been solved in high frequency trading for sure. So the way we solve it, right, is removing the human part, which seems like we might be able to do down the road. and then going to best-in-class kind of data stuff that like high-frequency trading already does.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are chips. So there's a couple of companies that actually have a full business based on putting chips in the saddles on the horses, so you can see sort of where they roughly are. It's still, that won't take it down to the level where there's just, one horse's nose crosses the line before another horse. So that's separate technology, right, where there's, HD cameras on the, that are looking at the photo finish example. So there's already a lot of technology that's used to sort of figure it out. It doesn't happen in real time. A lot of times it'll have to go up to sort of a human eye to look at the data because they can't figure out instantly. That just creates actually from a betting perspective, more opportunity for in-play, especially in Europe. Like there's a lot of betting that'll happen after a race where it's a photo finish and you're not really sure, before there's actually a final call. Like you'll still see activity of people going because they'll think one way or another. So there's, I think there's a lot of great examples about how it's being used currently in betting businesses sort of in a more advanced way, potentially, than it's happening in other business where they're not monetizing betting.
I agree with you. The humans are the problem, right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't have to
Not
move
to
to
be funny about
Skynet
it, like,
just yet.
They are. Like, that's sort of the cause of what the biggest challenge is.
I mean, that's the theme of this conference this year, right? Humans are just bad at stuff. Like the cognitive bias one, the money mind, that was the thing. And like,
That's
the
right.
more that we can remove humans from this equation, the better we'll be.
We're going to...
That's scary.
Good luck to all of us, right? You guys, the students are screwed right now. Like, we're getting rid of the humans.
But you're not. Somebody has to build Skynet for us, okay?
Yeah.
Seriously, and nobody's going to come out and if it really works, say like, hey, I've got Skynet. What you're going to do is you're going to wind up testing it against the market first. You're going to say like, all right, in order to find out if this works, I'm going to go to Vegas. I'm going to move to London. I'm going to go somewhere down south where it's really warm, and I'm going to try this technology. And that's why there has to be also, in part of this liberalization that we hope for, is that for students, young innovators, investors, when they do this, that they can move back into the performance analytics world for the franchises, for the leagues, because again, like Ted, he's a perfect example. Ted Knutson, who I mentioned earlier, and others, where look, this is being able to participate in the betting markets is a great way to essentially develop a farm system for these people. I mean, betting syndicates, betting companies, garage band guys getting together and pooling their bankroll and trying it for a year, like their gap year in Vegas, is a great way for these guys to develop these platforms. And eventually, that can become a system that fuels innovation, fuels investment here. But the attitude we have to get rid of the attitude of, all right, if you did that, you can't come back to this side. I mean, nobody is disqualified from being Treasury Secretary of the United States because they were at Goldman Sachs.
Or they talk to Russia or anything like
well,
that.
we don't disqualify anything like that. We're not making any political statements. But the ability to have a legal wagering market, be able to fuel innovation, to be able to support these students, support what investors put their money in, is going to be really important. That's why when I go to London every year for the ICE conference, the technology that you see people are developing and it's supporting it, I constantly say like, wow, just imagine if NFL teams or NHL teams were utilizing that in a way that they weren't betting, but they were using it to analyze individual player, player performance. Would be spectacular.
So what is it? Here's a question that I'm interested in. What do you think the value, let's say what's the average NBA franchise worth right now? $1 billion? $1.5 billion?
Yeah.
Sure.
Let's say it's $1.5 billion, right? Sports betting becomes legal in the US. What does that valuation go to?
It's funny because the problem isn't the availability of sports betting. The problem is the availability of legal, regulated, taxed sports betting, right? So there's already, I would say, I think the estimates that I've seen before is that you'd see roughly a 10% increase in interest of viewing of the games by people being able to participate in a legal sports betting market. That seems pretty profound. I imagine that would give a pretty substantial multiple to any of those franchises. You know, that level of engagement, or is it a way of, in a fragmenting media culture, a way of arresting declines? You know, with the drop in viewership of, for instance, the NFL that was reported earlier this season, you know, is that a way of being able to arrest a decline in that? It certainly would, because when you look at how streaming video in, like Bet365 is great at this, when you're streaming video, even on lower tier, like the second Albanian soccer league, and you're streaming it on a betting console, a live betting console, the way that is driving betting action in Asia and places like that is simply spectacular.
I think it depends, Jeff, to your question. Depends what's implemented. So I think there's been countries around the world who've implemented a legalized approach to gambling, and whether that's having a state lottery that controls the sports book, which is their format of legalized gambling, and it just hasn't worked. Or they have...
In those regions, is there still like a really strong illegal component?
It strengthens it, essentially.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those companies, some of them are forced out because the taxes are so high. They have these outrageous turnover taxes, and they're saying, well, either I have to drop my turnover exponentially, or I'm going to have to leave the country because it just doesn't make sense for me to operate here when I have high... And then that's the problem. It comes back to, if you implement something that works and it works well, it's good. Or you could implement something, there's a scenario where it's legalized really poorly, and it makes it even worse than it is now. And everyone else is leaving because anyone who's a legalized sports book would then say, well, the turnover tax is too high. I don't want any turnover. So anyone who has any sort of system or who's smart at betting, any of that turnover is going to disappear. They're not going to get anything down. The liquidity and the volume in the markets is going to be essentially eroded, and then they're going to be forced offshore anyway. Yeah. So there is a scenario where it's legalized, it's implemented throughout the US, and it's done poorly, and it makes it worse. Yeah. So I think for the value of the franchise, if it's done well, if there's a federal framework that works, that's really considered, and it takes in all stakeholders, especially the bettor, who is probably going to get lost when it is discussed, because they're the end. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter what the bettor wants. It's what the leagues want. It's what the government wants. It's what, you know, the associations who are involved, whether it's problem gambling, which needs to be allocated some money. It's what they want. And at the end, it becomes a situation where there's just no liquidity or volume in the markets because they didn't think about the end consumer, who the bettor is going to be. And if they have a need to get $500,000 down in a game because of their system they created, they want to get volume down, they can't do that, well, they're going to go somewhere else. So it really depends, and if it's done well, there's a huge possibility that it adds value to these franchises. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
It is. Joe made a great point in the beginning, and I want to get to some of the audience questions, but sort of making the argument about legalizing sports betting can't be about, well, it's already being done, so we might as well legalize it and tax it. The better argument, the more rational argument, and the more forward-thinking argument is this is an opportunity to innovate. This is an opportunity to grow a space in which we are not growing right now, in which other markets are actually surpassing us. That just feels like a better way to frame the debate that we haven't really talked about before.
Yeah.
Just making a statement.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
I think
That's absolutely right.
there's every possibility that from 2020 to 2030 in a legalized US betting market, that the next Airbnb, the next Uber, the next whatever it might be, comes through the betting industry. I mean, there's a lot of numbers out there about worldwide turnover on betting and how popular it may be in the US. And if it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and someone does it well in a framework that makes sense, then there's every possibility that the next Instagram is a betting business that does it well. So
let me ask some questions. Besides real-time win possibilities, what are other tradable assets that will eventually foster live buy-sell side trading?
Well, just real quickly on that. Right now, in-game betting, while it's fascinating and it's representing the majority of the handle that both European and then our informal friends, US-facing operators are doing, it's kind of I would say, frankly, a boring and uninspired, because all people really are doing is they're betting on adjusted in-game spreads and totals. Getting more into the individual performance, like taking a page out of fantasy, where we're looking at, okay, Atlanta got behind early in a game, so is Matt Ryan really going to light it up and being able to do improved in-time, real-time player props and things like that? That's more interesting, and frankly, that's really going to be engaging. But again, that's going to require the an increase in the pace of the data that's going to be available to operators.
Right, and to the extent that the leagues and the teams are starting to track all the player performance data, that'll be another monetizable asset that they can go out to operators and sell and trade off for value, for sure.
I'm glad you brought that up, Kip, because one of the questions is, will athlete biometric data be used in sports wagering? I don't know that you guys would have opinions on the second part of the question, but I'll ask it. If biometric data is used in sports wagering, how will athlete privacy rights be respected?
Yeah, I would have to say that I really think now you're starting to cross a line here. That just seems too invasive even for we're hungry for every data point that we could possibly get, but I would find it hard to believe that, well, frankly, somebody like a DeMaurice Smith would stand up and say, yes, the members of my union, I would be happy to make their biometric data in-game available to you. It seems a bridge too far.
I don't agree. I mean, like,
Shocker.
There you go.
I mean, just the reality is just like that's counter to everything you've been saying this time, which is like if it gets legalized and it becomes like front and center, that technology will advance to a place where every edge, every piece of data is analyzed and whatnot. Like why wouldn't this transfer to that idea, right? These people are, I mean, it's already invasive, right? They're already in the public light as much as possible. Like why wouldn't we want to know that?
I guess what I would say is, me as a person, that's where I would start to have a level of discomfort. Do I think bettors, market makers and things like that would exploit it? Yeah, probably. But for me, myself, I'm kind of, that might be a...
Because you wouldn't want to know what their, like you think it's invasive for you to know what their pulse is at that time?
Well, because what it implies is you also know what the basal level of those numbers are. Like imagine, in order for those numbers to be of value, you have to know what, for instance, Antonio Brown's base level heart rate is. All of those particulars, you would have to know those prior to the game and then measure the variance in order for it to have a kind of value for you. I mean, you could look at it in game in particular and just see like, oh wow, he's maintaining an elevated heart rate, he's not recovering fourth quarter. But some of that stuff is kind of obvious. There's data, there's data for data's sake, and then there's data that actually gives you a signal that's worthwhile. Being able to measure relative fatigue levels and things like that. Yeah.
You're
so now I'm essentially arguing for it. So
yeah, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like if you, let's go to something we understand, the public markets, right? Public companies have to disclose everything, right? There's so much stuff that they have to disclose, and these, if we start formally betting on sports, those are just companies, and these people are part of those companies, right? And the athletes, like. I am all for their privacy and like they shouldn't have to be scrutinized, but like their biometric information, why is that such a big deal? They're athletes.
Like I said, I mean, I'm sure somebody at my company would say, "Shut up, Joe. We want that data." That would be the point that I would just say. Me personally, I would have it. Like I said, you would have to know the base level. What the person's ongoing state is. How frequently do you get to update that in season, things like that. And again, that's where I see the athletes themselves starting to say, like, "Yo, brother, we're not going to give that to you," and they're going to push back.
Let's take it outside the humans for a second. In horse racing, this is something that actually, forget about ethics, right? Mm-hmm. This is something that could potentially be possible.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the sport is progressing in terms of what the disclosures are and the health checks, and there are health checks that are going on with the horses, in advance at races. So that's all moving on, and all that data is important for other reasons as well, right? Like, so, it's important from an integrity perspective too, which is a really important aspect of data and how sports betting will eventually come to the United States. And I think that's a critical thing when you think about how will regulation evolve and how will it ultimately roll out? But having access to all this data, that's important to monitor, and that's important from the league's perspective too, right? Like they want that data so they can understand what is the betting activity that's happening behind the scenes, to monitor from an integrity perspective. And we've been doing that in Betfair's business now for close to 20 years, where we've had deals where we're actually giving betting data to all the sports governing bodies, whether it's the IOC or whether it's the tennis associations, the horse racing associations, to monitor those things.
So we got 5 minutes left. We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. Where was that? Oh, here we go. Do younger generations' viewing habits and esports eventually propel sports to adopt betting to keep viewership? Jake, your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. What I will say is that esports is growing, and everyone sort of knows that, and it's pretty clear now. But I think that's the target demographic that everyone's looking into. So those younger fans, and I think I heard here yesterday, I think it was on the international panel that you were on, how they were saying basically used to be putting a ball in the hands of a kid, and that would be how they would adopt them to take on that sport. Now it might be playing Madden, it might be playing FIFA, if whatever that might be, and then you've got all the play charts within Madden, things like that. That's how they're adopting those younger fans now. So I think it's certainly an aspect that needs to be looked into and considered, and how it can be sort of used in a holistic solution with getting that target demographic and changing the sport in certain ways, whether it's shortening it, whether it's just delivering how it's delivered now. I mean, you don't really watch TV with ads anymore. It's changed from Netflix type stuff where you can pay a fee to get it without ads. So I think all that fits in the same bucket and how you approach that demographic. And I think esports is a very interesting young sort of growth area where I think trying to get those younger fans who are interested in those types of things is going to be interesting.
Joe?
The challenge you have with esports is the fact that about 80% of the audience is under the age of 18, and 2/3 of it is in China.
I don't think the question is about esports. I think the question is about the audience that's interested in that.
Yeah.
How do you sports betting
well,
to
I think,
increase their interest in other things?
Yeah, obviously, I think sports betting is a way of being able to stabilize interest in, obviously it's an increasingly fragmented culture. The one thing that you can say about sports is that young or old, rich or poor, it's still the most reliable content area. It's practically the only reason that a lot of people still have a television in their house rather than just relying on YouTube and streaming video that they can watch. I know it is in my household. I can't think of anything I watch on my television other than live sports, and the same goes for my son and for my daughter. So yeah, absolutely. But it's not also the betting, but is there a sensible way that the experience can be integrated in? And I mentioned before the way that some of the bookmakers and regulated markets have integrated the streaming video actually right into their interface, like their in-game interface. If there's a way that that can be done with the leagues and the way the leagues are satisfied with it, that's a spectacular way of being able to fight that back.
Jeff?
I think it's generally, it'll grow the pie, period. Like we keep talking about that, and I think like the theme of this, the idea that like we're really missing out as a country because we're not legalizing it, and we're not allowing the innovation that will come from it, and we're not allowing the engagement that will come from it. It just doesn't make any sense. Like the more, like I'm convinced now after this panel that it's even more so that it's important. As far as like the esports demographic, like I personally don't get it. Like I would never, but it's huge, right? And so I think for any of us to say like, oh, sports betting will help stem that tide, I think that's kind of silly. Like they're a different demographic. They think about things differently.
Yep.
I think it's a great example of how streaming, right? If you look at Twitch and you look at the platforms and the availability of the content, that's really the example, I think, to the rest of the sports universe about how important that is, and the accessibility to the content, streaming, et cetera, has created a betting opportunity and a monetization opportunity and engagement, that is now exceeding some traditional existing sports, right? So I think that's the lesson to be learned.
I got to say, this went in a completely different direction than I thought it was going to go.
Yeah.
But it was a powerful conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining the panel. Thanks to everybody for showing up. That is the end of our show.